That's a starting point.
Thank you.
Carrying on as best you can.
Yeah, I mean, the president.
Had a big meeting yesterday.
Good morning. We were waiting for Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He's on his way, but you know, Representative Garamendi and I looked around and realized, you know, we're on the House side, so we can lead off, and the Senate can have the last word. So we'll get things started. So I'm Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota's 4th Congressional District, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning. And I want to thank the work that my House and Senate colleagues did in using their leadership capabilities to put together this important caucus hearing today. The International Conservation Caucus has a reputation on Capitol Hill of strong bipartisanship and constructive engagement on important global conservation issues. And I am thrilled to be here, and I'm eager to learn more about the crisis facing the irreplaceable wildlife in Africa. Our witnesses are experts and global leaders in defending wildlife on the ground, in the political arena, and through global advocacy and education. There are no more committed champions to protecting endangered wildlife and ending the slaughter than the people here today. Undersecretary Hormats, Dr. Fay, Mr. Sanders, and my friend David Barron, thank you all for your gracious participation here today. We are, however, discussing what is truly a disturbing subject. The wholesale slaughter of elephants, rhino, and other species of animals across the African continent is a problem that requires local solutions, global engagement, and U.S. leadership. As we will discuss today, the epidemic of poaching for profit is creating an ecological crisis, fueling national security and criminal threats, and ultimately will make poorer across the African continent only poorer. With elephants and rhinos being slaughtered at a frightening rate, it's even more sophisticated and systematic methods, it is time for action is now. There clearly can be no more delay. Undersecretary Hormats, your work is critical, and I want to extend my appreciation for your commitment and tremendous commitment of Secretary Clinton to make the protection of African wildlife an issue, a priority, and a global concern. The Secretary's comments last week were right on spot. Ultimately, stopping the poaching, slowing and ending the demand for ivory and rhino horn, and protecting both endangered African species and their habitats will be challenging. And it's a challenge that must be embraced by African presidents, parliamentarians, scientists, NGOs, and those who live in the local communities. The rest of the global community and all of us must be partners, investors, advocates, and help to provide the resources, the capacity building, and the other tools needed to combat the very well-organized and brutal enemy, the poachers and their financiers. We also have a responsibility to target the demand side of this equation, which is ultimately putting the guns and cash in the hands of killers. And Mr. Royce, I knew if we got started, more people would come in, and so with that, I would turn this over to you. And I'm very excited, as I was saying, about this hearing, and thank you for your work and your leadership in setting it up, sir.
Thank you for all your work on this issue, and please excuse my voice. I did want to recognize Michael Fay, who's with us. Michael, if I could just ask you to stand for just a minute and recognize you for your work, especially on the issue of the global poaching problem. And some years ago, Michael and I had the opportunity to work together on the Congo Basin Forest Partnership Act, which would set aside 7 landscapes across sub-Saharan Africa to protect those environments from poaching. But today we have a very different and more insidious type of poaching out there, and that's why I think it is so important that we begin to deploy our resources, our intelligence resources, on what is happening. You look at organizations like the Al-Shabaab, and Michael Fay can tell you, you can fly over areas today and look down and see where every bit of wildlife has been absolutely eliminated from the landscape by Al-Shabaab. You can go into the DRC, in areas where Joseph Kony has operated with the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, and you can see the same thing. And these criminal networks are poaching in order to get the hard currency, which allows them to continue with their acts of terror, whether it be against civilian populations. The LRA, of course, is kidnapping children in order to pillage and rape and continue its existence. But in so doing, it takes the ivory and it sells that ivory to these criminal networks, often African-based, but managed through Asia with these criminal syndicates. And we have an opportunity, I think, to use the resources of the United States and our allies in order to penetrate and monitor and break up these criminal networks. And that is what is necessary, because taking on this type of poaching is a far greater undertaking than what we're usually used to in past experience. And so I just want to thank everyone who is engaged in this effort and express that nothing is at risk more than the extinction of some of these species. And if we all work together, I think we can make some real strides here. John Garamendi? Okay. Senator, if I could ask you to say a few words.
Go first. He was here first.
We need not debate this, but thank you. I'm really delighted to see this hearing take place. My wife and I have spent our tour in Africa beginning in 1966 as Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia. And for my wife, having traveled in virtually every African country when she was the Associate Director of the Peace Corps, this is a major issue for us personally. My own tenure on the Board of Directors of IFAW and continuing on to this day, I don't want to say more. I want to listen, and then we need to develop a plan. And I thank you very much for the leadership, Mr. Royce, Ms. McCollum, and Senator, for your efforts in providing that leadership. It has to be done. It must be done for all the reasons stated, and for most of the reasons, I guess all the reasons will be stated at this hearing. Thank you.
See how I get this to work. There we go. First, let me thank everybody for being here today to help raise awareness and discuss solutions to the international problem of illegal wildlife poaching. I'm very pleased to serve as the Senate co-chair of this with my colleague, Representative Royce, and I thank him for his leadership. I also want to express my appreciation to Representative McCollum, who I understand is not only here, but will stay here as the rest of us have to move around to other hearings, and that's a particular duty and burden on her, and I appreciate very much that she's done that. And of course, my friend John Garamendi, I appreciate very much that he is here as well. Congress has to work in a bipartisan fashion with the administration to put an end to the unlawful killing of wildlife, which is now occurring at alarming and historic levels. Recent press reports indicate that poaching has links to armed militias, to terrorists, to organized crime. Speaking at the State Department last week, Secretary Clinton correctly characterized illegal wildlife poaching as a threat to security, stability, and the rule of law. I would add that it threatens iconic species on our planet. We must simultaneously work to protect wildlife, combat trafficking, and reduce demand. Accordingly, I want to thank all of the witnesses from the administration, from the scientific community, and from the NGOs for coming together today to discuss this problem. I especially want to thank Undersecretary Robert Hormats for his leadership on this issue within the State Department, as well as Secretary Clinton for making this a priority, and of course the irrepressible David Barron for the ICCF's work to generate national and international attention. While all responses to this issue are important, investigating and prosecuting wildlife crime is a particular responsibility of governments. The conservation community has played a key role, educating leaders and citizens around the world to reduce demand, preserve habitat, and generate diplomatic support. But they cannot combat militias or take down transnational crime. That is the job of governments. The United States must be a strong ally in these efforts by enhancing existing programs and working with other countries to follow the problem to its roots. We should aim to reduce demand for ivory and other products of poaching, take down ringleaders through international law enforcement efforts, and protect wildlife populations to prevent their devastation. Advanced technologies and modern forensics can aid these efforts. While the focus of today's testimony will be on the poaching and trafficking of African land species, I also want to take this opportunity as co-chair of the Senate Oceans Caucus to remind my colleagues of the illegal wildlife trade in the marine environment. Illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing that targets whales, turtles, tropical fish, and sharks also removes iconic species and hampers tourism that supports local economies. Illegal fishing efforts that cull sharks for their fins, for example, have put 1/3 of open ocean sharks and rays under threat of extinction. While finning bans have been adopted for most international waters, lenient enforcement standards weaken their effectiveness. Illegal fishing in commercial fisheries undercuts the market for the fishermen who are playing by the rules. Global losses from illegal fishing are estimated to be between $10 and $23 billion annually, representing between 13 and 30% of total fisheries production. An Interpol summit report earlier this year stated the following: fisheries crime undermines resource conservation, threatens food security and livelihoods, is linked to up and downstream crimes, including money laundering, fraud, human trafficking, and drug trafficking, and is destabilizing vulnerable coastal regions such as West Africa due to its close links with corruption. In sum, poaching of all kinds threatens resources, economies, and stability of countries across the world. I applaud the State Department's commitment to strengthening a global system of wildlife enforcement and USAID's work to strengthen law enforcement and regional anti-trafficking networks. I hope that Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Justice training programs for foreign law enforcement officials and prosecutors are prioritized and expanded, and that we encourage Interpol to take the lead on coordinating more intensive investigations that will lead to convictions. I also hope that our diplomatic efforts can urge countries to ensure members of their militaries and law enforcement agencies are not looking the other way or even participating in trafficking of wildlife. The upcoming Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora meeting in March presents a chance for the U.S. to articulate our commitment to this issue. I look forward to working with everyone to reduce demand, increase enforcement, and protect wildlife populations. And I thank you all for being here today to address this important issue. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I'd like to just take a minute and introduce Undersecretary. Oh, Karen, hello. Congresswoman Bass, would you like to say a few words? Okay. I want to thank Secretary Hormats for taking the time to join us, because an Undersecretary's schedule has little room, so his presence, I think, shows us the importance he puts on this issue of poaching and trafficking, and the high priority that the State Department puts on it. But I also wanted to thank you for the comments last week by Senator Clinton that she'll be asking the intelligence community to produce an assessment of the impact of large-scale wildlife trafficking. I think we all look forward to seeing that assessment and seeing what it uncovers and how the intelligence community can be integral to addressing this problem. And I think, if I could also just say that the purpose of this event is to bring together all of the stakeholders, the administration, the House and Senate, conservation NGOs, and others into one room to closely examine the not just alarming rate of poaching, but the violence that has really caught the attention on the global illicit wildlife trade and made it so dangerous. Secretary?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I just want to start out on a personal note to tell you how inspired I am by the fact that you've called this hearing, and there's so many people here. This is a demonstration of the intensity of feeling
Microphone actually on.
in this Congress and among.
Could I make sure that you've touched the button?
Yeah,
There.
it's green, but can you hear now? Yeah,
There you go.
thanks. I just want to say how inspired I am by the fact that you and members have come here today to participate, and that so many people are here and feeling so passionately about this issue. Maybe this is better? Okay.
We heard you.
All right, thanks. This is an issue that we have spent a lot of time on and are working on for all the reasons that you've mentioned, and I will describe in greater detail. In fact, seeing these pictures from the National Geographic reminds me that, in fact, yesterday I gave a lecture, the Fuller Lecture, that was sponsored by WWF at the National Geographic, and there were something over 300 people, experts from all over the world. And the fact that we're getting so many people feeling so passionately about this underscores to me that we really do have an opportunity to take some bolder actions and more comprehensive actions and more successful actions than has been the case in the past. From my point of view, there is a very personal element to this. While I was a graduate student in East Africa, I spent a great deal of time, virtually a year in there, as a wildlife guide in some of the game parks of the region, Amboseli, Serengeti, Ngorongoro, Masai Mara. And so, from my point of view, seeing these magnificent animals in their native habitats, and then seeing the slaughter that has occurred with such brutality and with sophisticated weaponry, and at such an intense rate, the rate of the slaughter is actually accelerating quite dramatically. To see these elephants and rhinos and other animals killed is just, to me, is a profoundly moving experience. And I would just characterize this as really a moral outrage, and it should be a moral outrage for everyone, whether they've had the pleasure of going to Africa and seeing these animals or other animals in their native habitats or not. The fact that so many of these animals are being slaughtered. And for what? What are they being slaughtered for? Rhinos for rhino horn powder, which is supposed to cure diseases but does not. Ivory, trinkets, ornaments. This wonderful article, Ivory Worship, done in National Geographic, explains this terrible trade and wonderful animals being killed for their ivory, which is just used for ornaments. It's so offensive. It's such a moral level that it really has to make everyone, I think, pay attention to this and really commit themselves to very, very significant measures. And I want to thank the International Conservation Caucus and David in particular for the way he pulls together people, because his great strength is not only does he understand these issues, but that he understands that they have to be dealt with collectively in a bipartisan way with the government and the private sector and the NGOs all working together. And it's that spirit of passion and organizing a major effort collectively that I think is important. Let me describe a few of the things that we're doing in the State Department to underscore the kinds of issues that you have described, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and then we can go into some detail. One, as you both mentioned, Secretary Clinton hosted this high-level discussion at the State Department just last week, and this was really a first. And I want to give you a little personal background on this to give you a sense of why we did this before I get into what we're doing. The State Department has been working on this for a long time. We have OES and other bureaus of the State Department that have been focusing on this for many years. But I had the opportunity, along with Secretary Clinton, to go to Southern Africa a few months ago. I went to Namibia and Botswana, and then we joined up together in South Africa. And the stories we heard, and the pictures we saw, and the passion we heard among leaders of this country, particularly Deputy President Motlani of South Africa, that they were outgunned. The slaughter was so intense and so brutal that we came away just feeling that we had to really up our game and up our effort and intensify our effort. And so we built on a lot of the work that had been going on in the State Department with NGOs, and we'd been meeting with NGOs on a regular basis before that, but we decided this really has to change and we have to do a lot more. And as a result, we're doing and are planning to do a number of things, and that trip really catalyzed a lot of intense feelings that I had, and I know the Secretary had about this. So what we're doing is trying to pull together a wide range of people and a wide range of programs and strengthen them and strengthen their effectiveness. As I say, we've always considered wildlife trafficking and slaughter as a critical conservation issue, and we've been working with leaders globally and nationally on this. But the elements that you've discussed have added another dimension, and that is the only way you can describe this is a major and growing element of international crime, syndicated international crime, along with drug trade, along with trafficking in humans, along with the arms trade. This is a multi-billion-dollar crime network that links the poachers, the weapons purchases, the transportation of the goods, the animal products, the movement of money around, and the distribution to various parts of the world. Not just East Asia and Southeast Asia, which are major markets, but some of it actually comes here. We're the second biggest importer of some of these things. So this wide-scale wildlife trafficking and slaughter with advanced weaponry is a phenomenon that is new in some respects, but even if it's been going on for a while, the intensification, the brutality, is what really is growing in significance, and it presents a threat certainly to the animals when we see the pictures of the slaughter. But game wardens have been killed. In the last year alone, something in the order of 100 people who were working in the game parks to protect the animals were killed by these poachers. It also devastates the parts of the country where these poachers are. They take slices of the country, swaths of the country, and claim it for their own and just have free reign, where they bribe people or kill people or pay people off and undermine the justice system. So in many of these fragile democracies, fragile countries, the government simply can't govern in those areas, or there's sufficient bribery that the role of the capital is undermined by these regional factions that dominate this. So the whole question of stability and rule of law in parts of Africa is undermined. And then again, we're now looking into the question of how this relates to other aspects of organized crime. And one of the reasons we wanted to use our intelligence services to focus on this is to get better information on how to go about doing this, who these people are, how do they move their money, how do they move their products, how do they market these things, how do they communicate with one another. We've been able to do this quite well with respect to drug trafficking. We've got a lot of experience with respect to drug trafficking and human trafficking. We've really not used our intelligence services very effectively to address this new type of wildlife trafficking, and we have to do this in order to know who's doing it. There are lots of charges around about militias, about armies, about various groups that you've mentioned, and we need to get more information to know who's doing it, how they're doing it, and if we get that, we have a better chance of figuring out how to stop them. And how do they relate to the drug cartels? How do they relate to the weapons cartels? How do they do their bribery? And they just wreak havoc on countries. And this is a stability issue, and it's an issue for all the people who live in these areas who want to make a living, but find this brutality, in effect, undermines the stability. And one of the points that we were discussing a few moments ago is I had the chance to go to Namibia and Botswana before going down to meet the Secretary in South Africa. One of the things that's increasingly important is to give these people an opportunity to have an alternative to wildlife trafficking and poaching, so that if we can work with them to enhance their stake in conservation. And Namibia does this particularly well. They have a number of these conservation areas that the government has supported, and people actually benefit from protecting the wildlife. Tourists come there, they make artifacts, they make things that they can sell to tourists. They take pride in their animal heritage. And even in this area called Caprivi Strip, which is right at the sort of top of Namibia, if you go to Etosha and you go north and you go east, this is an area with a lot of animals, and they trample on land periodically. Not one of the farmers there argued for killing the animals. They all argued, they said, this is our patrimony. We have to figure out how to protect these animals and avoid this. So you get this buying in, and that's what you really need to make people on the ground feel more comfortable and buy into the process. So the State Department's trying to do a number of things. One, we're certainly trying to elevate this to a head of state level. And this is what I think is a starting point. It's certainly not an ending point, because, as we all know, communiques themselves don't necessarily do anything unless there's follow-up. But for the first time, we were able to get a head of state document at the APEC summit, which took place in Vladivostok, where we had all the Asian and Pacific heads of state there and signed on to this. The President and Secretary of State are going to raise this at the East Asian Summit, which is coming up in Phnom Penh next week. So we want to raise the visibility of this issue. We are working with other governments. We had a meeting, I think the first ever. We pulled together a group of ambassadors from various countries: Africa, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Australia, and other parts of the world, to pull them together to demonstrate that we needed to work with other countries in order to develop a collective strategy, because you need everyone involved. You need the supplying countries, you need the victims of this are the countries from which these animals come and where the killings take place, and then the countries that buy most of this. So we're trying to do four things. One is focus our diplomatic engagement at the highest possible level, which is heads of state and ministerial level, and to raise the political will, because you need the buy-in. I mean, one example is President Putin. We may have issues with Russia in some areas, but President Putin's quite a passionate advocate of wildlife conservation, particularly tigers, but also Amur leopards and other things. So if we can work with countries and get heads of state engaged, that helps a lot. Second, raise public awareness. This is an enormous challenge, and we think that we can do this, and we have to find ways of doing it. But the way of doing it is to have campaigns, and there are many NGOs here that are really good at raising public awareness, but governments have to do more and more. And we've actually gotten some fabulously good ideas just over the last several weeks about how we can use social networking among younger people, because younger people can demonstrate to themselves and to their parents it's not cool to buy ivory products that you put on your shelf or on your mantelpiece, or tiger rugs, or use the ground rhino horn for allegedly medicinal purposes, which of course it isn't. So what we want to try to do is utilize public diplomacy and utilize all of our embassies and use our ambassadors. We have a number of really passionate ambassadors. We want to use all of our public relations facilities to address this issue. Just to give you one example, tragic. There was a survey taken in China. 70% of Chinese don't realize that in order for them to get an ivory ornament, an elephant has to die. They were under the view that you can get the ivory and no elephant dies. You just sort of cut the tusk off and get the ivory and the elephant goes on. These kinds of things need to be addressed. The question of rhino horn powder. I did a blog with Harold Varmus, who won the Nobel Prize for his research on cancer, who's now head of the National Cancer Institute at NIH. And we did a joint blog, and we got it out to East Asia. It was utilized in 300 separate publications. And the ministers of health read this, bought in, got more information. We have to do this on multiple levels, getting experts, and also people like Yao Ming is very actively involved in this in China. Leonardo DiCaprio has been engaged. We need to get people who people listen to and pay attention to. On the 4th of December, we're going to have we're going to call Wildlife Conservation Day, and we're going to have events here and have events all over the world in all of our embassies. Every one of our ambassadors, or at least most of them who are going to be there, are going to do this. I'm actually doing one in China with NGOs, wildlife conservation NGOs in China, and meeting with their Minister of Forestry. The Ministry of Forestry runs these in China. So we've got to do many of these kinds of things, these outreaches. Then one of the things we're working on are these wildlife enforcement networks, or WENs. Our OES Bureau, Carrie Ann Jones, has been working on a number of these things in the Horn of Africa and Central Africa to promote regional cooperation, because all of these things are regional in nature. You need to do them in Southern Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, because the animals, of course, move across these borders. USAID has provided $24 million to help enforcement agencies under what's called Asian WEN and another program called ARREST, which is Asia's regional response to endangered species trafficking. And these are support programs that we think can be very helpful to people in the region to help with training and help the judicial systems to identify and prosecute these people to the fullest extent of the law. South Africa, for instance, just put someone away for 40 years for this. So if we can get more of this, that would be terrific. Last week, Secretary Clinton announced support for creation of a global system of WENs, which will share some of these things. We're also utilizing our International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Bureau to support International Law Enforcement Academy programs that provide for multilateral law enforcement, strengthen wildlife investigations. And we have 2 centers. One is in Bangkok, and one is in Gabon in Botswana to do this. So we're working on a wide range of things, and these are just a few of the programs that we're doing. So we want to, and I'll conclude on this note, our view is that we need to do a lot more, and we need to do it with every country in the world has to be, and we're going to use all of our ambassadors, not just in Africa and East Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia, but throughout the world. And we also need to support the kind of programs that I've mentioned to, along with CITES and other groups, to make sure that we have a collective multilateral response to this. It has to be multilateral. We have to engage every country in the world in all of our facilities, and we have to work with the Congress as we move along. And you, Mr. Chairman, we've had conversations about this, and I know of your commitment and members of the committee, and very importantly, and I see in this room some of the most dedicated, committed people in the world who have enormous expertise and enormous passion about this issue. So one of the things that we need to do and will continue to do is work with the NGOs who are involved in this process, because not only can we learn a lot from the NGOs, but the only way the government can be effective is to be a partner with NGOs in addressing these kinds of issues. So I just want to again thank the International Conservation Caucus for organizing this, and just to say from my point of view and that of my colleagues, this is a high priority. We want to make sure that it's not just something we do while we're in office, although we will do it as forcefully and as effectively as we can, but we want this to be a legacy. We want to institutionalize this, because this won't be cured in 1 year or 2 years. We can make major impact, where we've got to sustain the effort, and it has to be an all-in process. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Hormats, I think you're right about institutionalizing it, and a part of that is the Consular Corps that's here with us today. I just wanted to recognize South Africa and especially Kenya for their work, if they could stand. And also the ambassadors are with us from Gabon and Namibia and Cameroon, and we wanted to express our deep appreciation for all of the assistance from the embassies in this regard. Now I'll turn to Congresswoman McCollum for her questions.
Thank you. Secretary Hormats, I really appreciate all the effort that state has put in on this issue. But I've traveled in Africa a lot, and I know AFRICOM, sometimes DOD, is working, with governments on how to do, better law enforcement, because often the law enforcement on many of these issues fall to them. And they are providing training. We are providing at times basic equipment. Do you see a role, or is the Secretary having conversations with the Department of Defense and AFRICOM on how we might help? You mentioned the Intelligence Department, but that would be something I'd be interested in.
Yes, the State Department is playing a role, but I just want to say that other agencies are very, very committed to this. The Department of Defense, for instance, General Ham has had meetings, the head of AFRICOM has had meetings with heads of state in West Africa and Central Africa to discuss this. The Fish and Wildlife Bureau has been really superb in doing a lot. As you know, they're part of a number of networks. USAID, as I mentioned, is very actively involved, and we're getting our intelligence services more actively involved. So, yes, this has to be an all-in sort of full-court press effort where we engage all of our agencies. And I think what we want to do is work with the Defense Department. In fact, they had representatives who came to the meeting we had with the ambassadors to participate in that. So we're committed to this, and they do have a knowledge, and they do have an engagement with some of the militaries of the region. So we want to be able to draw on their contacts and their expertise.
In light of that, are there some things that we need to do congressionally to work with the administration so that you have the authority, and not just trying to cobble things together executively, the authority to do what you need to do, have an organized account, and where resources can be held accountable in a very transparent fashion? Are
Yes.
you having discussions with congressional leadership on that?
Yes, that's a very good point. We have a lot of we were discussing it earlier. We have a lot of programs. Various agencies are doing various things, and I think we have the authorities. Although we're going to check and see that we do, but I think we have the authorities we need. Then the question is, do we have the resources we need? And we're going to be in the process of determining whether we need more resources and how to allocate those resources, because this is something we have to, as we develop our own budgetary process, given the importance of this subject, we're going to have to take a look at how we allocate our resources, how much we need, and whether we're allocating them in the right way. So that we will be coming back to you. We got this exercise ongoing as we speak to figure out how we internally in our department, working with AID and other agencies, the Fish and Wildlife people, how we do this. So we will be sharing our thoughts with you. Once we get our intelligence reports, we will have a better idea. And it's very interesting. Yesterday at this event at the National Geographic that WWF organized, I met with an expert who does a lot of work on the DNA, and they can look at the tusk of an elephant and determine where, through the DNA that they scrape off the tusk and the ivory, where that came from, which in his view, and he's got a very good tracking system, gives him a sense of actually where it came from. Sometimes it's difficult to know if it's being sold in a market in Hanoi or Beijing. Where did it actually come from? So there are new methods of determining where the ivory or the rhino horn or tiger parts come from, and that'll help us. But we really want to get to the bottom of who's doing this. How do they get helicopters if they're using helicopters? And there's an argument that they are, but we need to really pin this down. If that's being done, who's doing it? Where do they get helicopters? It's not so easy to find a helicopter floating around. You have to find some way. Someone sold it to them. They didn't pick it up on the streets of Nairobi. So we have to figure out how this happens. And there's a lot of NGOs who have a lot of good information on this. And obviously we're going to be using our intelligence capability to find how is the money moved. With the drug trade, we have a pretty good idea how the money is moved, and we use the Treasury Department to interdict a lot of that money, or to have banks be more vigilant. How is the the ivory moved. And one of the things we're going to do is work with the airlines. It's illegal to move this illegally poached ivory. I mean, they're under CITES, which many countries are subscribers to. But how do you get the airlines to agree to best practices on how to interdict this and get them? Americans and others, we're not the biggest buyers of some of this illegally poached ivory or rhino horn, but if we can get our airlines more engaged, we can get others more engaged, and we can really use that as a way of interdicting them. And also the big shipping lines, greater degree of vigilance, making sure that they pay attention to what they ship and start rooting it out. Some countries have done very well. I want to particularly commend President Bongo of Gabon, who burned a lot of the ivory and has really been a leader. We had a chance to talk to him. So, and our ambassador in Gabon and Cameroon, both those ambassadors have been very actively involved in thinking about how they can work with the shipping companies or the airlines to stop this. So we're trying to use the knowledge and skills of all of our ambassadors in this area. As I say, we have this very good dialogue, and we want to develop it. And Kenya has done a really excellent job in addressing this issue. So, of course, and the ambassador in Kenya participated along with the ambassador of Indonesia in this event that Secretary Clinton chaired. So we really want to work with Kenya. And, of course, South Africa, Deputy President Motlani was the person who really, when I spoke down there to leaders, was passionate about this issue. And I think we'll be able to work with South Africa very
There is a lot
clearly.
of passion on this issue. Do my colleague, we have some other speakers, and I know that we got started late, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Mr. Garamendi, Ms. Bass, do you have a, please?
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And I appreciated you talking about how in some countries they're looking at alternatives and ways for the wildlife to contribute to the economy. I had the experience of going to Botswana and visiting an area where several villages got together and essentially created this high-end resort.
Yes.
And and they're they're generating about $500,000 a year that they're plowing back into the village. So that was, an exciting development. But I wanted to ask you a few questions. I thought you said in your testimony that the U.S. was the second biggest importer. So I want to know if you would address that. But also, what does the Chinese government say, and also the Vatican, especially given that, some of, the ivory is used as religious ornaments? And then what type of collaboration exists here in the United States with the whole animal rights movement? I mean, you have big movements, demanding that elephants be treated better in zoos. And I'm just wondering what is the linkage here?
Thank you. Well, 4 good questions. I'm conscious, Madam Chair, of the time, so I will try to do this quickly. The things we import are somewhat different from the things that are imported into Southeast Asia and China. Theirs tends to be a lot of ivory and rhino horns, and a lot of products show up on the streets of Beijing or Shanghai. So we want to work with the Chinese, and the things we import are somewhat different. We import a lot of endangered birds, tropical birds get imported here, smuggled in. Very, very valuable birds get smuggled in. People put them in their homes, and they're not supposed to do that. It's illegal, but they come in anyway. Skins of various kinds of endangered reptiles are used for all sorts of purposes, fashion goods and things of this sort. Many people don't know they're illegal when they buy them in a store or they buy them on the internet. A lot of the stuff sold on the increasingly sold on the internet. So we have to do, Fish and Wildlife, Customs, and others have to be more aware of this, and we're making a major effort to do just that. So we understand that we can't go around pointing fingers unless we ourselves are more effective and more vigilant, because then we're more credible. That brings me to the second point, the China point that you've mentioned. China is a real challenge because one of the reasons that the price of all these things has gone up is that the demand has gone up because there are more and more wealthy people who want to buy this. And the article Ivory Worship underscores that point. Beautifully written piece with pictures that are quite shocking to show what goes on to kill these elephants. So we have to do an educational job, but the Chinese are very good at protecting their own wildlife. Pandas, the penalties in China for killing endangered species in China are very stiff, particularly pandas, but other parts of, they have a lot of wildlife, bears, wild animals. They and they're very strict about protecting them. So if we can take that same zeal for protection of wildlife that the Chinese use internally in China, and explain that they need to be just as vigilant with respect to wildlife of other countries, particularly in as much as China wants to develop better relations with Africa, at the same time as you're engaged in a process, or your companies are engaged in a process of undermining the patrimony, killing the patrimony of these countries that you want to have closer relations with. There's an inconsistency there. And what we want to do is work with the Chinese to get greater education and get, on their part, a more vigilant set of policies by their people at the borders, and to get this illegal ivory trade stopped entirely. I mean, they're part of CITES. They have legal obligations here as a result of that, and I think it's important to work with them to help them understand how harmful, how destructive it is to African countries that they want to have closer relations with, and that they don't need to buy this ivory. They can use other things for ornaments. So I think working with the Chinese, that's a major goal.
Mr.
And then the Vatican
Mr. Ambassador,
will have...
may I interrupt
Sure.
you for a moment?
Sure.
What exactly has the State Department said to China? Exactly.
We've had exactly. We've had conversations with
whom?
With the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador here.
Here in Washington.
Yes, we have.
How about in Beijing?
Well, that's why I'm going. I'll
When?
be there. I'll be there December 4th.
And what will you say?
I will say to them what I'm saying to you, and that is that essentially they have a strong tradition internally of protecting their wildlife, and they need to take the passion they have protecting their own wildlife and translate it to protecting wildlife around the world, one. Two, that a lot of the stuff comes into China. Now, how does it get into China? Who's engaged in the trade? You know, it's hard for us to know exactly who's doing it, but a lot of it is sold, and that article pointed this out, a lot of it is sold by companies.
So you're going to express to them their own philosophy of protection?
And try to
raise the
internationalize
question
it.
about illicit trade into their country?
Yeah, enforcement, essentially.
3?
Number 3 is to figure out ways in which we can utilize the kinds of
capabilities. You will then talk
capabilities.
about ways in which we can work with the Chinese to stop it. Specifically, what ways?
Specifically, how do you
What
get?
will we do to help them stop
How
it?
do we get customs officials to be able to be better able to look for this? How do you create a process in the judicial system for prosecuting people and making sure that they get stiff penalties, to explain to them what we're doing and what other countries are doing? Because a lot of it is domestic enforcement of the law, or toughening up the law, one of the two, but also making sure
But
that
you've
it's
not yet answered my question. What will we do in cooperation with them?
Oh, we will be very happy to provide information on best practices here and how we are able to do this most effectively, and what we've learned from other countries. So we want to make sure that they, first of all, we need to get a buy-in on this. That's the critical part. But second, if they do recognize that this is something they need to be
I guess
vigilant about it.
what I'm interested to hear is, it's going to be the normal diplomatic dance, or you're going to get to the point?
Pardon
To
me?
the point of the 4 questions. Are you going to press them on this issue?
Of course, absolutely. That's why I'm going. Press them, underscore that they have an interest in doing it, and underscore that we...
You then, on completion of your trip, report back to us on the accomplishments?
I'd be more than happy to do it. But let me just make the point that it won't be just me. The Secretary of State and the President are going to raise this at the meeting, the East Asian Summit, at a very high level. So we're going to be doing this. It's not just going to be one meeting with the Chinese.
And you will let us know what they have accomplished also.
I will let you know what they've accomplished and I've accomplished, and more importantly, how we're going to sustain the effort, because one or two shots or one or two conversations are not going to do it. This has to be something they have to understand, the buy-in. They have to understand what they need to do, and we have to be constructive and helpful. Thanks.
The Vatican.
Oh, the Vatican. We have not had, to my knowledge, a conversation with the Vatican, but I think it's a very constructive idea. We need to enlist all we can. There have been meetings of religious groups that have discussed this, because virtually every major religion preaches the importance of protecting nature and protecting the gifts that God gave us, and so we need to utilize religious groups. Definitely, all of them, and we need to do that.
Seems like they could make a definitive statement saying not to be used.
I think if you could get religious groups to understand the seriousness of this, you can accomplish a lot. And I do think that's a very good suggestion. There have been meetings, but whether we've been able to get the kind of full understanding of how bad this is and get them to do this. If you had one day where all the religious groups that were engaged in this were to talk about it and make it a major feature of their own sense of protecting nature, that would be very helpful. As many groups as we can get, that'll be what's needed.
Very good. Thank you so
Thank you
very much. We look forward to hearing
Thank
your
you.
report
And I look
back.
forward to reporting back on China and all the other things, because I know there's interest here. And it won't, I promise you, it will not be just diplomatic conversation. If all we have are communiques and conversations and we don't achieve real progress, we're not helping the animals. So we need to get buy-in and action. So I will assure you, you will find no one more passionate about that than myself.
Very
Well, you
much.
will, because there are a lot of people here who are just as passionate about it. So.
Thank you. Well, next we're going to hear from Dr. J. Michael Fay, Senior Conservationist, Wildlife Conservation Society, Explorer in Residence at National Geographic Society, which has done so much to highlight this with their cover story on blood ivory. So thank you again so much for being here, Undersecretary.
I'll look forward to it. And I'll come back and report. Because I think, we do have to report. Did you meet you just very briefly?
Thanks. Please do.
And joining Dr. Fay at the table is Mr. David Barron, who needs no introduction, I don't think, for anybody that's here today, the founder of ICCF, as well as Mr. Jan Sanders, Executive Director of African Environment Film Foundation. So, gentlemen, do you have a sequence in which you would like to go?
Mike, I think you're first. Mike, all right?
Dr.
Okay.
Fay, the floor is yours.
I'll just jump right in then. It's great to be here today. Thanks for inviting us. I thank Chairman Royce and Senator Whitehouse and the other members of Congress here, and also Undersecretary Hormats and Secretary of State for starting to look at this issue more seriously. I just flew here today from the Republic of Gabon yesterday in the Gulf of Guinea to specifically address you because while you guys are kind of looking at the fiscal cliff here in the United States, from where I stand over in Africa, I see a much bigger cliff that this country must address. And while it pains me enormously to see elephants getting slaughtered by the tens of thousands now in Africa, and it truly is what we could describe as kind of a holocaust that's going on. The problem is really much bigger than ivory. It's virtually all wildlife, wood, fish, gold, every single natural resource, and the situation is devolving very rapidly. And I've been over there for 35 years working on this stuff on the ground almost every day, and believe me, it's never been like this ever in the last 35 years, not even close. Over the past month, I've been out at sea in Gabon looking at the nexus between fishing, oil field security, piracy, organized crime, corruption, border disputes, and illegal immigration in the Gabonese EEZ, the exclusive economic zone of Gabon. And, you wouldn't normally think that conservationists would be kind of using those terms or thinking about this stuff, but, it's all about that these days. If you look at what we normally end up doing on the ground in Africa when we are dealing with conservation, we're dealing with organized crime, we're dealing with corruption, we're dealing with a lack of governance, we're dealing with all these issues every single day. I'm working directly with the government of Gabon on a program that we're going to be calling Gabon Blue. And it comes directly from the president realizing that it's basically complete chaos out at sea. The ocean is being raped, and trawlers are systematically digging up the shallows. Shark finning is out of control. They're killing thousands of sea turtles every year. There's pirate boats all over the place. There's huge Korean cargo boats that are bringing in Senegalese fishermen doing long lining and gill netting off the Gabonese coast because there's no more fish in Senegal, or a lot fewer fish in Senegal than there used to be. The government of the president, actually, of Gabon last week had me address his entire cabinet to present a plan. And it starts with looking generally at Gabon's ability to manage and protect its natural resources at sea and provide security for the EEZ. And we really have, based on our analysis, determined that fishing, both legal and illegal, not only threatens the food security of Gabon through wasteful, predatory, and criminal behavior on the behalf of fishermen, but it is a significant factor eroding Gabon's sovereignty and debilitating governance. So, it's not just about, for me, using buzzwords like terrorism and money laundering and shell corporations. It has to do with a much more kind of insidious process whereby this global land and resource grab is resulting in responsible nations, people, and corporations losing out to those who are playing hardball. And with the line of between kind of legal and illegal purposely and intricately blurred. If allowed to devolve over time, good actors are replaced by bad actors. A positive feedback increases corruption, and it only gets worse rather than better. While all nations have a checkered past, perhaps in attaining wealth, I see this hardball game today in countries like Gabon emanating largely from Asia, and the trend seems to be exponential. One way to solve this, from our point of view, is to level the playing field by kind of degrading global standards, allowing our corporations, diplomatic missions, and citizens to engage in dubious and, in many cases, illegal activity, joining in the positive feedback, free-for-all, eroding the moral authority of all players. The only other choice, really, is to counter this trend. It's the only other thing that we can do to create kind of a positive feedback in the opposite direction. And this is what Gabon Blue is all about. With the help of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Geographic, U.S. NGOs and the Waite Foundation over the next month will be tackling the long overdue effort to completely shake up fisheries and to make them transparent, corruption-free, and productive for the country, to develop a legitimate fishing industry and to create a network of enforced marine protected areas. We'll be working with the Joint Task Force to police the EEZ using intelligence, remote sensing, and patrols, combat illegal fishing, shark finning, smuggling, illegal immigration, and piracy. We're also working with oil companies to create industrial no-go zones that secure critical infrastructure. The economic lifeline, really, of Gabon is oil, and especially offshore oil. At the same time, we're marrying kind of biodiversity conservation with all of these things. And just in the past month, just as an example, several Nigerian settlements kind of at the entry point from kind of Nigeria into Gabon that were fishing centers but also used as kind of clearinghouses for illegal immigration and trafficking have been closed. We closed them down. There were over 700 people that were transported back to Nigeria along with their fishing boats. But it takes kind of the opposite in hardball tactics. On land in Gabon, we're engaged in another program called Gabon Green with very similar objectives. And the U.S. Congress, including Congressman Royce in particular, were kind of at the inception of this program some 10 years ago. And originally it was to kind of set up a network of 22 different, what I'm calling kind of governance poles. And in Gabon, we have a network of 15 parks and reserves that serve not only as poles for biodiversity, but as poles for good governance to address corruption, collusion, and mismanagement in wildlife trade, the logging industry, mining, and instituting programs that are bringing order and transparency to these sectors. So governance poles are allowing us to secure large chunks of resource-rich real estate, and using data from the field as our empirical gauge permit us to really engage at the national level to change legislation and change kind of the structural reforms that we need to put in place, and getting anti-corruption kind of front and center. One example of that is a few months ago, we're facing a major incursion of West African nationals basing themselves in a very isolated forest in northeast of Gabon. And the camp went from about 400 people to 5,000 people, 400 to 5,000 people in less than 2 years. And they were engaged in not just gold exploitation, which was the main driver of this camp, but also poaching, ivory trade, gun trafficking, drugs, syndicated prostitution, actually bringing prostitutes into the country for the trade, and very sophisticated illegal immigration kind of network there. So empirical data from the field provided us with what we needed, and we got action from the president because of those data coming up from the field. And after what turned out to be a very peaceful operation, we were able to repatriate all 5,000 of those people back across the border, close down 20 satellite camps, and shut down what was a major challenge to law and order in northeastern Gabon. So left to grow, these problems devolve into the kind of chaos we are now witnessing in eastern CAR, southeastern Chad, southern Sudan, a lot of other places where we haven't really had the opportunity to put in place systems like we're seeing in Gabon, because we have a very willing and able partner there. We all worry about elephants, and not only because of their intelligence and in places a keystone species, but because they've become extremely valuable. Ivory has skyrocketed in value. 7 years ago, ivory was worth about $10 a kilo out in the field, out in the bush in Gabon. Today it's worth about $350 a kilo. and it's going up every day. And these guys are tracking the price on a daily basis, and they negotiate it based on SMS messages on the daily price. So it's really becoming extremely sophisticated, and everyone on Earth that is in this kind of deal is looking for ivory now, because it's one of the most lucrative products. If you bring it back to China, you can easily make 5 times your money. Whereas if you're buying gold in Central Africa right now, you can only make 10 or 20% on it. So ivory is definitely a major driver for what we're seeing. And elephants are getting hammered. One good example of that is Zakuma National Park, where I've worked quite a bit over the last 7 years. And in 2005, we counted, using complete aerial counts, 3,885 elephants in Zakuma National Park. Today there are 437 elephants in that park. And that is a pretty typical trend, I think, throughout most of Central Africa. And in places like the Central African Republic and the savannas, we've probably lost about 99% of the elephants in the last 30 years. That was a place that had well over 100,000 elephants in the 70s, currently has in the savannas maybe fewer than 1,000 elephants. So what are the solutions? In 2002, when Colin Powell came to Gabon to announce the Congo Basin Partnership, Congo Basin Forest Partnership, we were to set up 22 of these governance poles across the Congo Basin, and we were extremely optimistic that with the U.S. contribution and leadership, we would make progress very fast. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the project was taken over by folks who didn't understand the objectives or the reality of the problems on the ground. And this was meant to be a ground-up kind of operation. And we've been pushing for a number of years to redirect these funds to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who have the technical capacity and history to understand what is at stake and how to manage natural resources to the benefit and good for the good guys rather than the bad guys. Congress has listened, and we've been successful in redirecting a significant portion of those funds to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But in my opinion, I think we should just turn that whole project over to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We should maintain the funding levels that are currently in place, but we should just give it over to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and let them run the show. And, you know, we are making great progress there. Yeah, sorry.
Excuse me. Turn it over to Fish and Wildlife from whom?
From right now, it's being administered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USAID through the CARPE program.
Thank you.
So I'm just about done. The second thing that I think we should do is we should try to replicate that program in a project called what I'm calling the Sudano-Sahelian Initiative, and that would work in very insecure states going from Mali all the way to South Sudan, and we could create another network of these conservation poles that really do, you know, they create this kind of ground base. We have intelligence coming in every single day from the ground. We're working with all the local authorities. We're working with local military authorities. We're working with local villages. We really have a finger on the pulse of what's going on there. And if we can really combine those efforts with, you know, the intelligence community, the DOD, and others in an intelligent way, I really think that we can make progress. But it has to be done hand in hand, and it has to be done in a coordinated way, and people have to listen to people who are on the ground, rather than having special forces come in independently and working independently, and from my point of view, often not really getting the job done. So I think if we could do those two things from my perspective, where I am in Central Africa, support that that CBFP program, but turn the whole thing over to U.S. Fish and Wildlife instead of CARPE, USAID. That would be very positive, and starting up an initiative in the Sudano-Sahelian to replicate that be great. And, you know, if we can more generally work with the intelligence and military communities to really start getting at the more sophisticated networks and intelligence that we need, that would be fantastic. We could certainly use that in Gabon. Thank you very much.
We're just going to go through everyone. Mr. Barron, you're listed as next.
I think I'll defer. I'm going to be very quick with some conclusions, Madam Chair. I might defer to Ian Saunders next. Thank you.
Mr. Saunders, please. Thank you for coming.
Madam Chairman.
Saunders, the little light should be bright green.
Okay.
You're good.
Excellent. Madam Chairman, fellow witnesses, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm honoured to appear before your committee. My name is Ian Saunders. I'm a director of the African Environmental Film Foundation and a founder of the Tsavo Trust in Kenya. I live and work in a remote part of the Tsavo Conservation Area in Kenya, where I'm involved with wildlife and security-related issues on a daily basis. And I've been working in African wildlife conservation for nearly 20 years. As well as being an ecologist and wildlife manager, I'm a former member of the British military and a security officer, having operated on 4 continents on counter-terrorist, anti-poaching and counter-insurgency operations. In Afghanistan, amongst other things, I was one of the lead planners of the security operation in Kabul, delivering Afghanistan's first democratic elections. Today, I wish to highlight the credible threat which faces Kenya and the international community from the use of ivory and probably rhino horn as an untraceable form of revenue, funding extremist organizations such as Al-Shabaab, both in East Africa and potentially globally, and what can be done to mitigate this threat. In a joint video, Al-Shabaab leader Ahmed Abdi Godani said that he pledged obedience to the Al-Qaeda head, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Al-Shabaab is estimated to have between 5,000 and 10,000 core fighters. Their most spectacular operation outside of Somalia to date was in 2010, when they killed 76 people in 2 synchronized attacks in Kampala, Uganda. Recently, Al-Shabaab were forced out of Mogadishu by African Union troops supporting the new government forces, and in August 2011, and in Kismayo in September 2012, they lost ground in both major cities in Somalia. As is commonly known, Al-Shabaab is not centralized or monolithic in its agenda or goals. Its rank-and-file members come from disparate clans and even varying nationalities. The group is susceptible to Somali clan politics, internal divisions, and shifting alliances. While most of its Somali fighters are predominantly interested in the nationalistic battle against the transitional federal government of Somalia and not supportive of global jihad, the continuing influx of foreign fighters will affect this organizational balance. Kenya has faced the challenge of having a failed state on its borders and deployed men, women, and equipment into Somalia in support of African Union troops. However, after contributing to the success of denying Al-Shabaab access to 2 of its main revenue sources, i.e. the port of Kismayo and the massive trade in charcoal to the Middle East, the direction of their mission will undoubtedly now change from a conventional fighting to facing a classic counterinsurgency. Having witnessed similar evolving scenarios in other countries, I believe this will be a much longer mission and one that, if not checked, could grow exponentially from the shores of East Africa to the United States mainland. As we know, such things have happened before. In Afghanistan, opium had been a source of revenue for the Taliban. In East Africa, we are increasingly seeing that elephants are now in the gun sights of Somali and localized gangsters. The market for ivory is now at an unprecedented level, as is the poaching. I have previously observed credible evidence of organized criminal activity in the Tsavo area of Kenya, where shopping lists of ivory, list of expenditures, and telephone numbers of hawala bankers were found on dead Somali poachers. Whether executed by a poisoned arrow or an AK-47 round, the onslaught on Kenya's elephants is organized, and Al-Shabaab is placed in exactly the right position to exploit it. Ivory from Kenyan elephants has already been found in former Al-Shabaab strongholds. If indeed Shabaab are involved in the ivory racket, which I believe they are, the demand and the market for illegal ivory have the potential to generate funding to carry out increasing numbers of attacks, both within Africa and globally. For example, the estimated cost of the terrorist attacks on the 2 US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 1998 to the terrorists amounted to approximately 50,000 US dollars. The current wholesale price of ivory on the international market has risen from approximately $157 per kilo in 2008 to $2,357 per kilo in 2012, meaning that 22 kilograms of ivory now equates to well over $50,000. Taking an average ivory tusk weight of 13.6 kilos, approximately 30 pounds, only 1.6 tusks would be required to fund a spectacular double terrorist attack on 2 embassies in East Africa today. That equates to just one middle-aged elephant. The escalating poaching crisis threatens Kenya's security and economy in many ways. Poaching gangs not only kill wildlife but also terrorize local communities and threaten the valuable tourist trade. The implications of extremist organizations using ivory and rhino horn to fund their operations raises the stakes still further. Wildlife stability and prosperity are closely linked, and the value of Kenya's wildlife to the country cannot be overemphasized. Kenya is the cornerstone of East Africa. I believe that there is a credible and increasing threat that al-Shabaab are responsible for the killing of thousands of elephants, using ivory to fund their operations. Such a potential source of revenue is too convenient for them to ignore. International security and the survival of the world's largest land mammals are intrinsically linked. Today in northern Kenya, after years of tribal rivalry, a series of 19 community wildlife conservancies have demonstrated that stability, law and order, and prosperity can be achieved, and it is wildlife that has been the catalyst through the creation of community wildlife conservancies. The Kenya Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Authority, are playing a major role in supporting the development of more conservancies in wildlife viable areas, in addition to liaising with the Kenya Police to ensure that new and relevant security and law enforcement policies are in place to help protect rural communities living in previously high-risk areas. The Northern Rangelands Trust, acting in the role of a stewardship organisation, has brought together once warring tribes and helped develop tourism, conservation and other industries in these remote areas. A sense of community ownership is now developed in a way that has increased local prosperity, security and law enforcement, thereby helping to deny organised criminal and insurgent groups a foothold. Developing community-based security structures is not cheap. External support is required, but in the long run this is more cost-effective than supplying continuous food aid or deploying military peace support operations. The Tsavo Trust has now been formed to support the huge Tsavo conservation area in sensitive southern and eastern Kenya in much the same way. It is through these stewardship organizations that I believe the wider international community can really help to ensure greater internal security and conserve the economically and ecologically important wildlife in countries such as Kenya, and hamper the evolution of extremist organizations who prey on the poor and disenfranchised. The new security community law enforcement teams need basic support to enable them to operate effectively. They need training, they need uniforms, equipment, salaries, vehicles, fuels, radios, and training ammunition. The basic requirements to secure any remote community area at risk. Instead of Africa's wildlife funding illegal activity, it can become the catalyst for stabilization. It is interesting to note that the Tsavo National Parks are not only approximately the same size, but also the same age as the State of Israel. Israel is situated in an arid region, although that is where the comparison ends. Israel has a defense force of approximately 176,000 men and women to secure its borders, with an annual budget of approximately $15 billion. The Tsavos have approximately 400 rangers and a budget that is consistently training to support them. Kenya Wildlife Service is facing increasing challenges inside the national parks. However, this can be lessened with the continuing creation of community wildlife areas outside the national parks, where over 60% of Kenya's wildlife exists. The United States government has supported Kenya for many years and continues to do so. Such partnerships are vital to the security and prosperity of a country like Kenya and can help secure US interests vital to regional stability. In summary, I would like to ask, are we certain that we are doing enough to deny al-Shabaab and other organizations access to the source of funding that ivory can give them? which, if left unchecked, could not only result in the destruction of Africa's elephants, but help them evolve into a significant international threat. Thank you.
Mr. Barron.
Madam Co-Chair, our other friends from the International Conservation Caucus, Governor, we're learning more and more that wildlife terrorism is a global threat of epic proportions that is a direct and serious threat to the security in the United States. Natural resources are increasingly providing untraceable revenue for illegal and subversive organizations, and while rhino and elephant poaching are our immediate focus because they've reached crisis proportions, serious challenges continue to exist for other endangered species such as tigers and for natural resources such as fish and timber. Illegal wildlife trade is filling the coffers of terrorist organizations committed to attacking the United States at home and our interest abroad. As the demand from Asia continues to grow, the profits continue to soar for militants and others committing these atrocities, perpetuating the problem by raising the incentive and providing funding for even more sophisticated operations and weapons. Unless we take strong action to combat illegal poaching and trade of wildlife, terrorist groups will be increasingly fortified with funding and safe havens in Africa from which to launch attacks against the United States. We can address this threat by tightening U.S. laws, regulations, and enforcement, cracking down on U.S. shell corporations that allow laundering money through our banks, encouraging the U.S. military to take a more active role, supporting countries in Africa with funding for equipment, training, law enforcement, and law enhancement, supporting capacity building in affected countries, and making U.S. defense and other financial support contingent upon foreign governments' adherence to international law governing poaching and illegal wildlife trafficking. I respectfully suggest a number of steps that Congress might take immediately and in the longer term, and others that we should encourage the administration to take. First, make illegal wildlife trafficking a predicate offense under U.S. law, like drugs, counterfeiting, and human trafficking, enumerating it as a crime covered by the Transnational Organized Crime Strategy by the State Department Rewards Program. This is the Kerry Royce bill, and the Treasury Department's authority to certify money laundering entities under the Patriot Act. Amend H.R. 4077, introduced in the House in February and referred to Foreign Affairs to include poaching and illegal wildlife trafficking. Introduce poaching and illegal wildlife trafficking language into Executive Order 13582 to allow inclusion of these crimes as activities that define, quote, a significant transnational criminal organization, close quote. Inserting language as a provision in the pending foreign assistance authorizations to deny funding to foreign countries if the Secretary of State has creditable evidence of their engagement in, abetting of, or support for illegal poaching. Improve U.S. laws on ivory trade, which are currently weak and often involve insignificant penalties. Increase wildlife law enforcement training and law enhancement capacity building programs in targeted countries. And if I might digress just for a moment, for some of those who don't know what I mean by law enhancement, I point to, for instance, activities such as those that ICCF's partner, the Conservation Council of Nations, the CCN, is undertaken building multi-party parliamentary conservation caucuses to create political will and legislative understanding for mainstreaming sound natural resource management policies into national economic development planning. The CCN is building caucuses in cooperative countries with the greatest current needs. We call these the Tier 1 countries. They include Kenya, Tanzania, and Gabon, others in their neighborhood, and is working to anticipate other nations where problems are most likely to develop. We call this Tier 2, so as to engage them in caucus building and policy planning preemptively. Administrations come and go. Parliamentary consistency is an imperative. It's true in our country. It's true in others as well. The Secretary spoke earlier about engaging heads of state and ministers. That's very important. But we need to engage at parliamentary levels, and the leadership of the International Conservation Caucus in the U.S. Congress and in our partner caucuses can engage those parliaments most at risk, and we've done so, and it's already working and can work. And both of the the leaders on the panel today and the others who've been here, all of them, I think, have participated in this in one way or another. We need to include language as a provision of any defense authorization stating that none of the funds may be provided to any entity of a foreign government if the Secretary of Defense has credible evidence that such entity has engaged in, abetted, supported, or approved the poaching of wildlife. We should encourage DoD through AFRICOM to support anti-poaching with training and equipment to combat highly militarized poaching activities and share intelligence with local authorities. We should provide support through the Department of Justice to build capacity on prosecution and sentencing of wildlife crimes in targeted countries. We should encourage investment in community-based efforts outside parks and protected areas to increase engagement of local communities, like the Northern Rangeland Trust is doing such an extraordinary job of. And we should at least defend, if not ideally increase, current U.S. funding for protection and conservation of highly targeted species, which is extremely modest but greatly effective. A more comprehensive document with appendices and these particular citations I've made, I'm submitting herewith. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let you go first. Any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Among all of the recommendations, you alluded to, Mr. Barron, the work of Congress. You put it in a positive light, but if I recall correctly, there's a bill on the floor that significantly weakens the Lacey Act, which deals with the illegal trade of, or the trade of illegal products. That bill is not yet dead, although it should have never been born. But nonetheless, it is there, so I just draw attention to that. It could pop back into life in the next 2 months. The CITES conference is a few months off. There's been little discussion amongst the participants here, as well as the Secretary, about the CITES conference. Can we hope for any useful outcome from that conference? I hear silence.
Mr. Barron.
Governor, let me just tell you that I'm a hunter. I own a hunting reserve. I pay my bills by hunting. I think that animals have value to local people. The market forces can be unleashed, which will allow those people to benefit from those animals as they do other natural resources. I've been in favor of wildlife product trade when it's been legal and manageable, including the sale of ivory, which is the big debate at CITES in March. Mike Fay and Richard Ruggiero from Fish and Wildlife over the years have disagreed with me on this. I've accused them of anthropomorphic reasons for this. But the fact is that we've reached an epic proportion, and something dramatic has to be done. And the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Thais and others are using the legal trade as an excuse. I actually, in my private capacity, have been approached by one of the governments advocating this with the lucrative contract to represent them at CITES for what ideologically I would have supported and have supported voluntarily in the past. But I am adamantly opposed to the trade of ivory at this time. I don't believe in burning it. It has value. I think at some point it could be disposed of and that it could be utilized in order to produce income for greatly challenged wildlife operations in these poor countries. I'm adamantly opposed to the trade of ivory at this time, and I think that we should support that ban, continue that ban at CITES in March. At the same time, the South Africans have a problem with rhino horn. Similar, but it's not the same. And the South Africans are brass tacks, bottom line, very commonsensical operators, and they propose, as does my wildlife mentor, Dr. Ian Player, the harvesting of rhino horn to actually crash the market, to dump massive volumes of rhino horn on the Asian markets, but to harvest it sustainably, doesn't harm rhinos. And I support that with equal vigor as I oppose the trade in ivory at this time, because I think that that market could be destroyed by the South Africans single-handedly, who have over 20,000 rhinos that they've done a pretty good job of protecting in the past, but now they've got a serious problem too. I might tell you that I had 29 rhinos earlier this year. Never had one poached in my 25 years in Africa. We'd had 4 poached since Christmas. I couldn't afford it. I can't afford the police to protect them, can't afford the loss of the rhinos. So I got rid of all of my rhinos. To extract value from those rhinos unleashes the marketplace. I just happen to be too damn poor to afford it. But I think the South Africans might manage this and might actually undermine that trade and at the same time produce income which incentivizes people to own, breed, protect rhinos rather than dump them like I had to do.
Thank you. Other comments about CITES?
I would just go back to 1989 when we were experiencing the last major crisis with elephants. And the people, the pro-trade people, lobbied and put a lot of money into keeping the trade open for several years. And it cost the lives of well over 100,000 elephants in Africa before the trade was shut down, which was probably 90% illegal at that time. And the result was that there was no legal ivory out there, and the trade crashed, and the price of ivory in the field in Central Africa, when I was working there then, went from probably 25,000 to $50 a kilo down to you couldn't even sell it. And elephant populations almost immediately started coming back. And that's been true in Kenya and a lot of other countries. So when the one-off sales started a few years ago, people will argue about why the current trend started, and there's a lot of factors, but putting legal ivory on the market gives the wrong message. And I think that if Tanzania's request goes through this year, it will just send a very bad signal to the world that, you know, there's legal ivory and there's illegal ivory, and so we just got to police it. There just shouldn't be any ivory on the market. There just shouldn't be. If you eliminated 99.9% of the ivory demand, or convinced 99.9% of Chinese not to buy ivory, there's still 1.3 million people left in China to buy ivory. There's only 400,000 elephants left. Mm-hmm. There should be no legal trade. And so one-off sales by countries like Tanzania shouldn't pass. People should not vote for them.
Agree?
I agree with Mike, and I feel to say that I question the integrity of any government official from any country in the world that advocates the sale of ivory at this present time.
Well, we'll see what the American policy ultimately becomes. Thank you for that. A couple of other questions. Several times during this hearing, there's been alluded to the role of the American military in Africa. Let's go through that quickly if we could. The American military is supporting, through the AFRICOM section, mm-hmm. various governments and their military. What should be the message to the American Department of Defense and specifically to the head of AFRICOM? What should I write to them as a member of the House Armed Services Committee?
I mean, the armed forces of any country obviously have to follow the policy of the country they serve. But I think that if the armed forces in their position, the US armed forces in their position, can support the government openly as they're operating, and information pertaining to the use of ivory for funding questionable activities should be made public, and public so the international community can follow that up. And I think that there does need to be a time when naming and shaming has to be the order of the day.
Yeah, for a number of years in Central Africa and the Gulf of Guinea, the AFRICOM has had, DOD's had a program trying to reinforce marine security, EEZ security, oil field security, all kinds of illicit activity. And, you know, they come in and they do these training programs and, you know, they bring ships in once in a while and they've got all these sailors running around. But again, my feeling is that there's very little kind of use of real local knowledge to actually start kind of mapping out exactly what we can do. And I think that with our Gabon Bleu program that could collaborate with Equatorial Guinea, Sao Tome, Cameroon, along with DOD, we could make great strides forward very quickly with what DOD is trying to do if we were able to collaborate and work with those guys directly. But often we find a firewall between DOD and any other kind of input other than the local military. And so I think that finding a way to for us to directly collaborate with those guys as the National Park Service in the country or directly through the president, I think that would be extremely productive for both sides. And I think we could do that on land too. So just getting these guys, like with these conservation or governance polls, you know, if we could start working with those guys directly on the ground, where we have, say, 30 of these polls just in Central Africa, these guys in Kenya have another 20 or 30 all over Africa. If you all of a sudden had military assistants that are assisting with intelligence and real military operations, it would help us enormously. But right now there's a firewall between the two.
David.
Congressman, when AFRICOM was first announced, we did not do our political homework and prepare the way. As a result, I think one government was overtly welcoming us to set up a base there. When I went to the DOD and accused the Assistant Secretary for Africa of playing checkers when the Russians and the French beat us at chess, she said, well, we have to do it that way. We have to be overt. Well, we were going for eleemosynary reasons, not imperialistic reasons. We were going so we could have a position there to evacuate people, to provide aid, to provide assistance and intelligence, and yes, protect our interests, but we were really not there for what, for instance, the South Africans accused us of, and that's to become a military power to challenge others in the continent. We got a pretty lousy image. This could be a big energy boost for us. We're on the we are there. We have capabilities. They need a lot of training. I'll tell you exactly where they need training. For instance, in Kenya, where we've just come with a congressional delegation, they need training in collecting intel. They need training in marksmanship. They need training in attack dogs and sniffer dogs. They need the kind of training that good Marine Scout snipers can provide, but it's expensive as hell if you're paying for it privately, and the U.S. government can give that to them. And frankly, we're pushing people out of the military because we're winding down in other parts of the world. It'd be great to give veterans some jobs doing some of this. And they need equipment. They need night vision goggles. They need, they need some of the heavier stuff sometimes also, but we'll talk about that another time. But they need airplanes. They need used boats. You know, Mike needs a brown water Navy in the Gulf of Guinea. We got boats that we don't even use anymore, boats and motors and communications equipment. There's a lot of equipment we've got in warehouses that's just going to disintegrate and get recycled someday that we could be giving these people that would have great value there.
The fundamental argument that's been made here at this hearing is that the illegal poaching, which is illegal, is financing dangerous organizations, criminal, terrorist, etc. It's clear from other reports that have been given to Congress that Africa remains a very significant problem for the United States in that it is now and likely to increasingly become a harbor for terrorist organizations, which are a threat not only to the United States but to others around the world. In that context, this hearing has presented useful information about the relationship between poaching and international security. It would be helpful to me, because I am a member of the Armed Services Committee, to have a memo from you gentlemen about the ways in which the U.S. military can address the international security issue by dealing with the issue of poaching. Okay? I'm open to pursuing that issue. We've gathered a lot of information at this hearing today, but frankly insufficient for the type and the intensity of attention this matter needs. So if you gentlemen could provide that to me and to my colleagues, we'll see what we could do with it with regard to the military issue and the Department of Defense side of it. With regard to the issue of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the USAID and what is without surprise an operation that lacks the intensity that might be required or the effectiveness and efficiency. Again, a more detailed analysis and memo on that would be useful to those of us that have expressed interest here and others that you may know. And finally, it's always good to push the State Department, not only because it's fun, but it's necessary. So I think that completes the hearings, but let's do, as I always like to, one last statement from each of you.
I'd like to make a last comment on that point, please. AID is a development agency. It's not a conservation agency. There's some great AID employees that are conservationists, and they've funded good programs like the Northern Rangeland Trust, and they've some great officers that have been personally committed to successes in conservation. Development is an essential part of the conservation cause. Local communities that are the stewards of the great biodiversity and their habitat have to see it as important to their job creation and economic stability, their families' livelihoods, et cetera. And then oftentimes they're competing with wildlife. So development is an imperative part of this. We can't gut AID's involvement in conservation, or all their development activities will be extra conservation, and they need to be parallel. But they're not a conservation agency. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a conservation agency. The U.S. National Park Service is a conservation agency. The Bureau of Land Management is a conservation agency. NOAA and NIMS. And I mean, we have conservation expertise in the United States government, and that's where we need to concentrate, and that's where through which we need to coordinate our conservation effort. It needs to include state, because the value of engaging these other countries is essential. It needs to include AID because it needs to be compatible with and parallel with their development causes. But we need to get back to the basics that the International Conservation Caucus leadership started with a few years ago, and that's coordinating conservation within the U.S. government, the way, for instance, PEPFAR coordinated AIDS policy and programs. We need to get back to that, and I hope we will in the next Congress, with a master plan and with some coordination and cooperation through all of these agencies.
Thank you.
Yeah, I brought this paper today. In fact, Richard Ruggiero brought it. It's called Poaching and Anti-Poaching, Manavogunda San Floris National Park, Central African Republic. And it's by Michael Fay and Richard Ruggiero, and it was written in 1986. And at that time, this park of about 2 million hectares up on the Chadian border was one of these governance poles. And it was a chaotic situation up there. We had the war raging in Chad. We had the war raging in Sudan. We had tons of horsemen coming across the border. And we were holding our own. And this was a strategy document to kind of, institutionalize this and drive home the fact that if you have these outposts on the ground and you're getting the proper military and government support that you need and using foreign aid to drive governance at a local level, it really is important. It's a ground-up approach, and a constellation of these things all over would work. This place today is completely empty of wildlife. There were probably almost 1 million antelope in this park in 1970. There were probably 30,000 elephants there. There were black rhino. There were communities of people that lived around this at peace. Today, the main camp we lived in is a rebel camp, and it's invaded by hundreds of thousands of cows from Sudan and Chad. It is a lawless place that is costing the international community hundreds of millions of dollars today to fix. And if we'd have done this in 1986, I bet you we wouldn't be there today. We wouldn't be there. And I think that, we've been harping about it for years, and we can get this done. We just need to do it. That's all.
Ian?
Anti-poaching operations are by their very nature low-intensity counterinsurgency operations. That's exactly what they are. And the intensity is increasing. Now, the best way to win an insurgency is from within. And I think that by building the capacity of those on the ground, there's a lot of experience there, as Mike mentioned earlier. And then there's the ability to survive in these environments with minimal amounts of equipment. But the basics are required. I'm not talking about UAVs and technology. I'm talking about boots, the bullets, rations, fuel for cars. Anti-poaching operations forever getting new vehicles and no fuel to put in them. So a lot of the basics are missing. And intelligence is the vital component, because these operations are intelligence-led. Intelligence is a process. Information. On African operations, there's information everywhere. It comes in like confetti. Everybody is gossiping, everybody is talking. It's not managed. That's the key, and that's where I think some of the greatest assistance can come, is to assisting in internal organizations to manage their intelligence, so they can, the information, so can it be processed into intelligence and then used for tasking and coordinating in a more successful way. That would be my...
I've noticed we've gone to about our limit of time. At the table are three very important organizations. In the room are dozens more. We welcome all of you to provide information. Not that I need another task to do, but there are many people in the Congress that are interested in these matters, so please engage us as best you can find us. Thank you so very, very much. We'll conclude the hearing.
Thank you.